I'm Nick Ravelis, the Geisel Director of Education and Outreach for San Diego Opera. You're going to be seeing our wonderful production of Johann Strauss's Die Fledermaus. So I'd like to spend a little time with you talking about this terrific operetta and introduce you to the composer, the music, and the historical period that it comes from. So let's start with the background. Die Fledermaus comes out of a period when Vienna, Austria was experiencing a lot of changes. Let's take a closer look at that wonderful city as it existed in the 1870s. Vienna was one of the most important capitals of Europe during the 19th century and was often called the City of Dreams. Just the name Vienna conjures up images of sprawling palaces, rich coffee with whipped cream, broad streets dotted with horse-drawn carriages, and masked balls at midnight where champagne flows. This was the golden age of the Habsburgs, the most prosperous royal family in continental Europe, and Vienna was their capital. This atmosphere was perfect for the growth of the entertainment industry, such as it was, and in the midst of this, the need for entertaining music, party music, dance music, and theater music. It's fascinating that the production of virtually all of this music ended up falling into the hands of a single family of musicians, the Strauss family, who had no fewer than 6 members involved in part of a musical dynasty that lasted from the 1850s to the 1960s. The most important Strausses were the 2 Johanns, Johann the Elder, who was the first Strauss to be described as the Waltz King, and his eldest son, also named Johann, who single-handedly invented the dance which we all know as the Viennese waltz. This Johann Strauss Jr. gave us such famous waltzes as Tales from the Vienna Woods, Wine, Women, and Song, and On the Beautiful Blue Danube. The younger Johann Strauss would have gone into the music history books for only having created these beautiful masterpieces, but he did one other thing. He took what was once a French theatrical form, dressed it up with plenty of Austrian flavor, and created the Viennese operetta, an entertainment that audiences all over the world began to clamor for after the premiere of his most beloved work, the charming and hilarious comedy, Die Fledermaus. That's German for the bat. Now, I mentioned the word operetta a bit earlier, and maybe it's time to define that word. An operetta is like an opera in that much of the story is told through song, with characters dressed in period costumes, surrounded by beautiful sets and accompanied by the orchestra. But the big difference between operetta and opera is that in operetta, the style of the music is much more popular, and there's often more spoken dialogue in an operetta than anything that you'll ever get in grand opera. The operetta is kind of like today's Broadway musicals like Cats, Phantom of the Opera, The Producers, or Rent. The origin of the operetta was actually Paris, France, where in the 1850s the composer Jacques Offenbach was having great success with short one-act comedies that made fun of the politicians, aristocrats, and wealthy merchants of the day. Night after night, his theater was stormed by audiences starving for evenings of light musical entertainment. For those audiences, the opera companies in Paris were getting far too serious and pretentious for their own good, and Offenbach seemed to hit on a formula that proved to be really successful. Offenbach and his little operettas traveled throughout Europe, and it wasn't too long before his works were also the center of attention in Vienna, the City of Dreams, where young Austrian composers began to try their hand at writing similar works. But it wasn't until 1871 that the Viennese operetta found its most natural expression in the music of Johann Strauss. Born in 1825, the young Johann was the eldest of 6 children. His father didn't want him to get into music at all. He wanted him to go into banking, of all things. But under the watchful eye of his mother, he took violin and music theory lessons secretly until 1842 when his parents separated. After this, Johann took formal musical instruction and eventually wound up establishing himself with his own orchestra. It wasn't long before he was his father's only rival in the composition and performance of dance music, especially the waltz. After his father's death in 1849, his and his father's orchestras were merged into one, and he became the waltz king in the hearts of all Viennese. He was even given a royal position for his accomplishments. But remember, this was Habsburg Vienna, and virtually everything was accompanied by the infectious rhythms of the waltz. And no one, not even his father, could write a waltz quite like Johann Strauss. Now, like the creation of many great works of the theater, there's a lot of legend around the composition of Die Fledermaus. But I'll do my best to give you the straight facts. We do know that the composer Jacques Offenbach, the fellow who actually invented operetta and whom we talked about earlier, was a great admirer of the music of Strauss. And he told his fellow composer that his musical style could easily be adapted to the stage. Strauss was flattered but not entirely convinced. It was Strauss's wife, the singer, who tipped the scales by secretly having words set to some of his already existing waltzes and given them to the director of the Theater an der Wien, Max Steiner. The Theater an der Wien was one of Vienna's most important theaters. Steiner was a clever producer, and sensing that he could make a lot of money by producing stage works from the pen of Vienna's most popular composer, he did his best to find poets who could do justice to his music. With these poets, Strauss wrote a few early operettas, but they didn't do very well. It wasn't until the theater director Steiner offered Strauss a text that had been discarded by our French friend Offenbach that he found the inspiration to begin Die Fledermaus. This play was written by Offenbach's French poets, his official poets, Henri Meillac and Ludovic Halévy. And Steiner handed the French original play over to an experienced man of the theater whose work with the material made the story more truly Viennese. Now, according to legend, Strauss wrote steadily for 43 days, neglecting food and sleep until the work was finished. We now know that this is probably not true. The work was certainly outlined within a 6-week period, but it actually took 6 months before the work finally hit the stage in April 1874. The other myth that surrounds the first production of Die Fledermaus is that it was unsuccessful, running only 16 performances before closing. Well, now we know that another traveling opera company was booked for that same theater, the Theater an der Wien, and the operetta closed out of necessity, not due to lack of popularity. Its next production was in Berlin, where it took off like wildfire. Back at the Theater an der Wien for a revival later on that same year, it was a runaway hit. Since then, Die Fledermaus has never left the active repertory. Fledermaus was an early stage work of Strauss. He ended up writing 14 more operettas before his death in 1899, including operettas like The Gypsy Baron and A Night in Venice. After his death, Viennese arrangers took the more singable melodies from his dance pieces and created more Strauss operettas like Viennese Blood, Waltzes from Vienna, and Casanova. But he's remembered today as the composer of Fledermaus, an irresistibly elegant, stylishly melodic, effervescent piece that never fails to succeed with an audience. Although Die Fledermaus is a relatively short 3 acts, being a comedy of mistaken identities, it becomes quite complicated, but let's give it a try. We're in the home of the wealthy Viennese banker Gabriel von Eisenstein and his wife, Rosalinda. The first thing we hear is a young man serenading Rosalinda from the street. Adela, the Eisenstein's maid, comes in reading a letter from her sister, inviting her to come to a party that evening at the home of the wealthy Prince Orlovsky, an eccentric aristocrat. When Rosalinda arrives, Adela pretends that she has a sick aunt and asks for the evening off to attend to her needs, but Rosalinda refuses. Her husband Eisenstein must begin a 5-day jail sentence tonight for fighting with a policeman, and she doesn't want to be left alone. Adela leaves, but Rosalinda is soon visited by Alfred, the young singer who was serenading her out on the street. She can't believe the nerve of the man, boldly entering the house of a married woman like this, and she insists that he leave, and he does, but makes her promise to let him in while her husband is in jail. After Alfred leaves, Eisenstein arrives with his attorney, Dr. Blind. Dr. Falke, a friend of Eisenstein, also arrives and secretly invites him to that same Orlovsky ball. He can begin his jail sentence tomorrow morning after a night of celebration. In the meantime, Rosalinda, wanting now to be alone with her suitor, tells the maid Adela that she can go to visit her sick aunt. The table has been set for Rosalinda and her husband to have their final meal together, but Eisenstein has left, and in comes Alfred, the singing suitor. He begins to woo her, but they are interrupted by Frank, the jailer, who has come to collect Eisenstein. Caught in a compromising position, Rosalinda passes the young suitor Alfred off as her husband, and off he goes to jail. In the second act, we find ourselves at Prince Orlovsky's masked ball, and everyone has arrived in disguise. Adela, the maid, is disguised as the actress Mademoiselle Olga. Eisenstein is announced as the Marquis Renard. The jailer Frank is the Chevalier Chagrin, and Rosalinda arrives in the role of a Hungarian countess. In the midst of the party, Eisenstein recognizes his Adela in one of Rosalinda's evening gowns, and Rosalinda oversees him flirting with the maid. Falke reins her in from revealing herself, but encourages her to present herself to her husband as an object of flirtation. You see, Dr. Falke is out for revenge. 3 years ago, Falke, dressed from head to toe in a ridiculous bat costume, in other words, Die Fledermaus, had gone to a costume ball with Eisenstein and gotten terribly drunk. Eisenstein abandoned him in a public park where he passed out and then awoke the next morning to all of the citizens of Vienna laughing at him and calling him Dr. Bat, Dr. Fledermaus. As the party goes on and everyone gets happier with champagne, Eisenstein gets closer and closer to unmasking the flirtatious, mysterious Hungarian countess who is actually his own wife. But suddenly, the clock strikes 6, he must go to jail and begin his sentence. So what happens in the final act? What will Eisenstein think when he arrives at the jail and discovers his wife's young suitor, Alfred, there in his place? Will Rosalinda jeopardize her marriage by admitting her innocent tête-à-tête with Alfred? Will Dr. Falke exact his revenge? Well, you won't get the answers from me. You'll have to see the opera. That's the famous waltz featured in the overture of Die Fledermaus. It really captures the spirit of the entire operetta because almost every note of this work is inspired by the rhythms of the dances which were popular all over Europe in 1874. Although we think of Strauss as the waltz king, he was just as terrific composing other dances like the polka and the gallop or the can-can. The polka, a Bohemian dance introduced in Prague in 1837, became so popular that the term polka mania was coined to describe the phenomenon. The polka is usually a bright, quick dance with 2 beats per bar and that always has a great, catchy tune. Now here's what I mean by 2 beats per bar. You can count 1, 2, 1, 2 in a regular pattern. 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. And in fact, there are almost as many polkas in Die Fledermaus as waltzes. Here's an example, a polka that first appears in the overture to the operetta. A polka also appears early in Act 1 as Adela reads the letter from her sister inviting her to Orlovsky's party. Even Rosalinda gets into the polka. At the end of Act 1, she sends Alfred off to prison in place of her husband, and what do we hear? A polka. But it's the lilt of the Viennese waltz that gives Die Fledermaus its soul, and each waltz is composed in such a way by the composer to match the emotion in the story or in the text. The waltz is a dance in triple meter. That's 3 beats per measure as opposed to the polka, which is 2 beats. Here's an example of 3 beats per measure. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. But the Viennese waltz has a special lilt or accent, a little bit of a breath between the second and the third beats. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Hopefully you'll hear this lilt in these examples from Die Fledermaus. Here, Alfred invites Rosalinda to drink away their cares. In the Act 2 masked ball, everyone is in disguise. Here is the disguised Eisenstein approaching the disguised maid, Adela, absolutely sure that this woman is his wife's maid, but Adela puts him off with what else? A waltz. But listen to the character of this waltz, introduced by Dr. Falke at the climax of the ball as he toasts to brotherhood and love. Suddenly we realize that the waltz is capable of being melancholy, a little sad, and sentimental. But then, of course, we have the sparkling exuberance of the Fledermaus waltz itself, first heard in the overture, but then again as the culmination of the masked ball at the end of Act 2. This score is infectious. The tunes and rhythms just take you over and carry you away. That is, of course, what they hoped in 1874 at the Theater an der Wien when Die Fledermaus first premiered. The Black Friday stock exchange crash had occurred just 1 year before, and the royal house of Habsburg in Austria was beginning to fall apart like many of the other royal houses in Europe. What did audiences want to do in the face of all that? Just dance.